I woke up to find orange spray paint lines running across my lawn like a crime scene. Only it wasn't the police. It was the HOA. They claimed my property wasn't up to code, even though I'd never signed their rules, never paid their fees, and technically didn't even live inside their neighborhood. Within hours, strangers in reflective vests were digging at the edge of my driveway, waving papers I'd never seen before, shouting about violations I couldn't possibly commit. Neighbors I'd known for years stood on the sidewalk whispering like I was some criminal. And the worst part? I hadn't done a single thing wrong. Would you have stood your ground or lost it on the spot? Before everything spiraled into chaos, life on my property was quiet, steady, and exactly how I wanted it. I had worked for years to find a place where I could finally breathe, away from the endless rows of copy and paste houses, away from strict neighborhood associations dictating the color of your shutters or how many flowers you could plant in a garden bed. My land was my safe haven. The house sat just off a quiet road, with a gravel driveway that crunched beneath the tires every evening when I came home from work. A well on the property provided clean water, the kind that tasted fresher than anything you could buy in a bottle. To me, it felt like freedom. Neighbors passed by now and then, offering polite waves. For the most part, everyone kept to themselves, and that was just fine with me. I wasn't looking for drama or community events. I just wanted a little slice of peace. On weekends, I'd mow the yard, fix small things around the house, and enjoy the quiet hum of crickets at night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every nail in the walls, every inch of the land, it all belonged to me, and I took pride in knowing I'd built a life independent of anyone else's rules. What made it even better was knowing that I was outside the reach of any HOA. I'd heard the horror stories online, neighbors fined for leaving a trash can out too long, kids' bikes counted as clutter, and families told to repaint their perfect houses because of shade differences that no one could even notice. Those stories sounded absurd, almost exaggerated, but I was grateful I didn't have to live under those kinds of watchful eyes. I told myself I was lucky. Still, the HOA that bordered my property had a reputation. People called it the iron fence, not because of the gates, but because of the way they enforced every single rule, no matter how small. Their board president, a woman everyone quietly nicknamed Karen, was renowned for identifying the most minor violations and escalating them into full-blown cases. But I didn't worry much. After all, I wasn't part of their neighborhood. Their rules had nothing to do with me, or so I thought. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention to the way they eyed my property whenever they drove past. I may have noticed how the HOA trucks slowed down when they saw me working in the yard, how their board members lingered a little too long at the edge of the street. At the time, I brushed it off as nosy curiosity. It never crossed my mind that my independence, the very thing I loved about my land, would soon paint a giant target on my back. Because what started as harmless glances would soon turn into accusations, paperwork, and threats that felt more like they belonged in a courtroom drama than in a quiet neighborhood. And when the HOA finally made its move against me, it didn't just shake up my life. It showed me exactly how far some people are willing to go for control. I thought I was untouchable. Being outside their borders meant being outside their sphere of influence. But as I was about to find out, when an HOA wants to drag you into their world, lines on a map don't matter, and neither does common sense. At first, the trouble came quietly. A letter appeared in my mailbox one morning, folded into an envelope stamped with the HOA's logo. I remember frowning, confused, because I didn't owe them anything, and I wasn't even a member. Inside was a notice, worded like an official demand that accused me of unauthorized alterations to shared property. Shared property? My land was privately owned, with deeds and surveys to confirm its ownership. There wasn't a single square foot tied to their neighborhood, yet here it was in writing, claiming I had installed unpermitted infrastructure. They didn't even specify what that meant. The letter ended with a warning. I had 7 days to rectify the violation or face escalating fines. I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error. They may have sent the letter to the wrong address. I laughed it off at first, tossed it on the counter, and went about my day. But the very next morning, another notice arrived, this one stapled to a photograph of my property. They'd taken a picture of my well pump and circled it in red ink, as if it were evidence of a crime. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident. Someone in that HOA had decided my property was fair game. I called the number at the bottom of the notice, expecting an explanation. Instead, I was put on hold for 10 minutes before being transferred to a woman with the type of clipped, smug voice that immediately raises your blood pressure. She introduced herself as the HOA president. Karen, of course. Her words were blunt. Your property sits within the influence of this association, whether you signed paperwork or not. We've determined your water system violates our community standards. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal escalation. I couldn't even process it at first. Influence? What kind of legal nonsense was that? I told her flat out I wasn't a member of her HOA and I owed her nothing. She chuckled, like she'd heard that 100 times before. You'll find it's not that simple, she said. Then she hung up. That was the moment the knot in my stomach formed. Within days, the harassment escalated. Trucks with HOA logos began parking along the street outside my property. I'd catch men in safety vests with clipboards walking up to the edge of my lawn, scribbling notes, snapping photos. One even crouched near my fence with what looked like a soil probe, poking at the ground as if he were about to dig for buried treasure. When I stepped outside and confronted them, they didn't speak to me. They just nodded at each other, packed up their equipment, and left. But the message was clear. I was being watched. Then came the fines, official-looking papers with bold red numbers, $250 here, $500 there. Each one cited vague violations, such as unauthorized water extraction or encroachment on community resources. None of it made sense. None of it had any legal standing. Yet the stack of threats on my kitchen counter kept growing. I tried ignoring them, but that only seemed to embolden the HOA. One evening, I came home to find 3 trucks parked directly in my driveway. Men were unloading shovels, metal detectors, and even a portable pump. They told me they were there to inspect stolen water lines. My jaw dropped. Stolen water lines? I didn't even share a water system with them. I yelled for them to leave, but they just smirked, waving their paperwork in my face like it gave them free rein over my land. My neighbors stood on the sidewalk, watching, whispering like I really had something to hide. That night, I barely slept. If they could roll up with trucks and dig on my property, what would stop them from cutting into my well, or worse? But the absolute nightmare hadn't even started. Yet, because the HOA wasn't satisfied with intimidation, they were about to drag me into something bigger, something that could cost me not just peace of mind, but everything I had worked so hard to build. The lawsuit hit me like a ton of bricks. A thick envelope, hand-delivered, stamped with official court markings. The HOA was suing me for trespassing against community infrastructure and theft of shared resources. I read the words over and over again, my brain refusing to accept them. They were claiming my private well was siphoning from their system. It was impossible. My well had been drilled years before their subdivision even existed. I had all the permits, receipts, and geological surveys to prove it. Yet here I was being accused of stealing from a system that wasn't even connected to mine. I felt sick, angry, trapped. The next few weeks became a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and whispered conversations with lawyers. Every time I considered fighting back, the HOA intensified its efforts. They sent out newsletters painting me as a selfish neighbor who was robbing the community blind. They even accused me of damaging property values by refusing to adhere to standards. I couldn't go outside without feeling eyes on me. Neighbors who used to wave now crossed the street when they saw me. Parents pulled their kids inside if I walked past. The isolation cut deeper than the lawsuit itself. It felt like the entire neighborhood had turned against me, convinced by the HOA's propaganda. The worst blow came one morning when I looked out the window and saw orange paint sprayed across the edge of my yard again. Only this time, it stretched into the driveway, marking an excavation zone. They weren't just threatening anymore. They were preparing to dig. I called the police, desperate for help. When an officer arrived, I explained everything: the trespassing, the harassment, the bogus lawsuit. He listened politely, but when I showed him the paperwork, he frowned. "This looks like a civil matter," he said, shrugging. "You'll have to take it up in court." In that moment, it hit me. No one was coming to stop them. To protect my home, I had to do it myself. The pressure mounted. Every day, I'd find fresh notices taped to my door. Every day, the HOA trucks circled my property, like vultures. The court date loomed closer, and I knew if I didn't prepare, I could lose everything. Not because I was guilty, but because they had the power to bury me in legal jargon and endless intimidation. But what the HOA didn't know was that I had been quietly gathering my own arsenal, not of weapons, but of facts, documents, and allies who understood exactly how unlawful their actions were. And when the moment came to fight back, I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to dismantle their entire case, piece by piece. The stage was set. The pressure was unbearable. The HOA thought they had me cornered, but they had no idea what was coming next. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, almost claustrophobic, with dull beige walls and a faint hum from the overhead lights. Yet to me, it felt like an arena. Every seat on the HOA's side of the gallery was filled. Karen sat front and center, arms crossed, lips curled into a smug half-smile like she'd already won. Behind her, the board members nodded in unison, a wall of self-righteousness. On my side, just me, my lawyer, and a couple of friends who had stuck by me through the madness. The imbalance was obvious. They had numbers, they had money, and they had months of whisper campaigns poisoning the neighborhood against me. All I had was the truth, and a pile of documents I prayed would be enough. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Karen's lawyer wasted no time, striding forward with a thick binder and a booming voice. He painted me as a thief, a freeloader who had been stealing vital resources from a community I refused to support. He flashed photos of my well, of my property lines, of trucks parked in my driveway. Every word was delivered like gospel, and with each passing minute, I felt the weight of judgment shifting against me. I clenched my fists under the table. It didn't matter that his claims were nonsense. In that moment, optics mattered more than facts, and the HOA looked organized while I looked like a lone rebel daring to stand against the machine. When it was finally our turn, my lawyer stood calmly, almost too calmly. He didn't start with my documents. He didn't even start with me. Instead, he asked Karen to take the stand. She strutted up like it was her coronation day, chin high, confidence radiating off her in waves. The questioning started. How long had she been HOA president? How often did she enforce violations? Her answers were rehearsed, polished, and smug. She truly believed she was untouchable. Then came the pivot. "Mrs. Karen," my lawyer said smoothly, holding up a stack of papers, "can you confirm whether this is the subdivision plat map filed with the county when your HOA was established?" She squinted, then nodded. "Yes, that's correct." "And can you point out for the court where my client's property falls within this plat?" Karen's confidence wavered. She leaned closer, scanning the map, her lips pressed together. Finally, she jabbed a finger near the edge. "Here, right at the border." My lawyer nodded. At the border. Not within the shaded area marked as part of the HOA's jurisdiction, correct? Her eyes flickered. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. Karen stammered. Well, our influence extends beyond the borders. We have a right to protect community resources. The judge raised an eyebrow. Influence? Mrs. Karen, are you suggesting your HOA governs properties outside its recorded boundaries? Karen shifted in her seat, her face flushing. We ensure compliance in surrounding areas for fairness. That was the crack in the armor. And my lawyer drove the wedge deeper. He presented the drilling permits for my well, dated years before the HOA even existed. He laid out geological surveys proving my water supply was completely independent from theirs. He produced emails where board members openly admitted they had no jurisdiction, but wanted to set an example anyway. Each piece of evidence landed like a blow. Karen's face went from smug to strained, then from strained to outright panicked. By the time my lawyer finished, she was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. But it wasn't over yet. The judge asked Karen directly, "On what legal grounds did your HOA issue fines and notices to this homeowner?" Lawyer jumped up objecting, fumbling with his binder. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no answer. The silence in that room was deafening. And then, my lawyer delivered the knockout punch. He slid one last document across the table. A letter signed by a contractor hired by the HOA, admitting they had trespassed onto my property under Karen's explicit instructions. Not only had the HOA overstepped its authority, but it had also committed an actual crime in the process. The judge leaned back, his expression stone cold. "I've seen enough." Karen tried to speak, her words spilling over each other, but the damage was done. The gallery, which once seemed so united, began murmuring, confused and angry. A few people even turned on her right there, whispering accusations of their own. The judge ruled swiftly. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. Their lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never bring it against me again. Additionally, Karen and her board were found liable for harassment and trespassing and were ordered to pay damages and cover my legal fees. It should have felt like pure triumph, but in that moment what I felt most was a sense of relief. A crushing, overwhelming release of tension that had been coiled inside me for months. I glanced over at Karen. Her face was pale. Her confidence had been shattered. She looked less like a powerful president and more like someone who had finally come to realize the consequences of pushing too far. The courtroom erupted, some in outrage, some in stunned disbelief. But I stayed quiet, staring at the woman who had tried to ruin me. She had built her entire identity on control, on bending others to her will. And in the span of one hearing, it all came crashing down. As I walked out of that courthouse, people whispered, pointed, and even clapped me on the back. The tide had turned. The narrative had flipped. I was no longer the villain in their story. I was the one who had stood up and won. But even in victory, I knew this wasn't truly the end. Because in neighborhoods like this, power doesn't die quietly. And Karen? She wasn't the type to go down without one last move. Walking out of the courthouse that day felt like stepping into a different world. For months, my life had been consumed by paranoia, stress, and the constant fear of losing everything I had worked for. Now the weight was gone, or at least shifted onto the shoulders of the very people who had tried to destroy me. The sun seemed brighter, the air lighter, though maybe it was just my body finally unclenching after living in fight-or-flight mode for so long. The ruling spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Word of mouth, text chains, and even social media posts ensured that everyone knew what had happened. The HOA's carefully constructed narrative that I was a thief stealing community water crumbled overnight. For weeks, they had painted me as the villain, a parasite living off their resources. Now the truth was public. They had harassed an innocent homeowner, trespassed illegally, and wasted everyone's money on a lawsuit they never had the right to file. The board members tried to recover, issuing a bland statement about miscommunication and protecting community interests. But no amount of spin could undo the damage. Homeowners began showing up at board meetings, demanding answers and questioning every decision Karen had ever made. Fines that had been issued to other families were scrutinized, receipts were pulled, and old conflicts were dragged into the light. For years, Karen had thrived on fear, on people not wanting to be the next target. But once she lost against me, the spell was broken. Within 3 months, a recall vote was organized. I wasn't there the night it happened. Still, a friend texted me as the ballots were counted. Karen was removed as president by an overwhelming margin. She stormed out of the clubhouse that evening, red-faced and silent. At the same time, neighbors who once bowed to her authority now whispered about her downfall. For me, the financial outcome was almost secondary to the satisfaction of justice. The damages awarded covered my legal fees and then some. The HOA had to cut a sizable check, and watching them hand it over was a moment I'll never forget. That money wasn't just compensation. It was proof that the truth had won. Evidence that their intimidation tactics had failed, but the more resounding victory was intangible. The same neighbors who had avoided me, crossed the street to keep their distance, now came by to apologize. Some admitted they had believed the lies. Others confessed they had feared the HOA too much to speak out. I didn't blame them. Living under constant surveillance and threats can make anyone comply to stay invisible. But hearing those apologies helped heal the wound of isolation. Slowly, the looks of suspicion were replaced by nods of respect. I didn't become best friends with everyone overnight, but I no longer felt like an outcast on my own street. And that shift, subtle as it was, mattered more than I expected. As for Karen, she didn't go quietly. Rumor had it she tried to rally a smaller group of loyalists, pushing for stricter rules and vowing to restore order. But without her title, she was just another resident, bound by the same rules she once wielded like a weapon. I'd see her driving past sometimes, glaring at my property like it was a scar she couldn't cover up. And every time, I couldn't help but smile. Not out of spite, but out of relief. She no longer had power over me or anyone else. The long-term impact went beyond my own story. The county took notice of the case. Officials began looking into other overreaches by HOAs in the area, reviewing how far boards could push their so-called influence. What happened to me became an example cited in community forums and news articles about the importance of understanding property rights. My fight wasn't just personal anymore. It was a warning to others that these associations weren't untouchable and that ordinary homeowners could win. On a personal level, the ordeal changed me. Before all this, I valued independence, but I took peace for granted. I thought buying property outside HOA boundaries meant I was safe forever. What I learned is that power doesn't always respect boundaries. Sometimes it barges in, papers in, hand, confident that intimidation alone will make you fold. And the truth? For a while, I almost did. The sleepless nights, the whispers, the endless letters taped to my door, they were designed to wear me down. To make me question myself, to push me into compliance even when I wasn't in the wrong, but standing up, as terrifying as it was, proved something I'll never forget. You don't have to be powerless, even when the odds look stacked against you. Still live in that house. The well still runs clear, the driveway still crunches under my tires, and the nights are still quiet. The orange spray paint has long since faded, washed away by rain. But every time I see the faint outlines of where it once was, I'm reminded of the battle I fought and won. It wasn't just about keeping my property. It was about proving that fear doesn't get to dictate how we live, that no HOA, no matter how power-hungry, has the right to rewrite the rules of ownership. So when people ask me if it was worth it, the stress, the court dates, the months of living under a microscope, I don't hesitate. Yes, it was worth it. Because giving in would have meant losing more than a well or a patch of land. It would have meant losing my freedom to live without someone else's arbitrary control. And here's what I want anyone watching this to take away. If you ever find yourself cornered, targeted, or silenced by people who thrive on control, remember this story. Remember that their power only lasts as long as you let it. Remember that truth, persistence, and courage can turn the tide, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. Because sometimes, the fight isn't just about protecting what's yours. Sometimes it's about reminding everyone else that bullies, whether they sit on playground benches or HOA boards, can be beaten. And the sweetest victory isn't the check they're forced to write, or the title they're forced to give up. It's walking back into your home, standing on your land, and knowing deep down, you won.